say that the people who love Stanley's movies were mostly movie people. They're just looking at what's in the frame. What's the moviness of the movie? They, of course, love Stanley I find, in a very uncomplicated way. Whereas, the critical community tends to fuss and fidget over what Stanley did.
Why do we keep talking about Stanley Kubrick? Whatever you think of him, it's hard to deny that Stanley Kubrick was one of the most influential filmmakers of all time. The fingerprints of his style and the lingering ghosts of his works can be found everywhere from The Simpsons to Squid Game. Not to mention how Kubrick's techniques have inspired acclaimed directors like David Lynch, Martin Scorsese, and Quentin Tarantino, whose own oeuvres have gone on to profoundly affect the film world. And in the world of film criticism, dozens upon dozens of video essays will have started out with some variation of the last 4 sentences.
His mastery of each element in the filmmaking process is legendary.
Stanley Kubrick is a perfect example of a visionary director.
But the one name that stands out amongst the crowd is none other than Stanley Kubrick.
22 years after his death in 1999, Stanley Kubrick is surrounded by an enduring critical obsession, alternately revered and lambasted, eminently relevant. Which begs the question, why? Why do we keep talking about Stanley Kubrick? The answer is, of course, craft. We cannot ignore it. Kubrick is a popular talking point because he knows his craft and he utilizes it in distinct, intentional, revolutionary ways. Narratively, Kubrick is known for defying or elevating genre, using conventions as a springboard to talk about larger themes of violence, desire, choice, and fate. Often his versions of then-current genre conventions looped around to becoming new genre conventions themselves. The rogue AI, the use of ironic music, and the serious treatment of science fiction, to name a few. It thus becomes easy for the critic to connect Kubrick to the modern film landscape, even 22 years after his death, because his impact on modern genres and the timelessness of these large philosophical ideas are so apparent. Cinematographically, Kubrick's focus on theatricality and artificiality in his compositions, the idea of photographing a photograph of reality, draws attention not just to what is in the frame, but to the act of framing, the presence of the craftsman, the creator of beauty. Crucially, the reflexive nature of the cinematography is never just to show off Kubrick's aesthetic power, but to communicate visually the film's bigger ideas. In this shot from A Clockwork Orange, for example, the stylized symmetry of the frame and the slow pull out of the camera is a beautiful, technical shot. But it's also there to reinforce Alex's complete, godlike dominance over his world and his presentation of that world to the audience. Or, in The Killing, the tracking shot through Johnny's apartment is a slick way to transition, but it also communicates Johnny's confinement within systems and schedules, as well as The Killing's own constrained adherence to the heist genre. This combination of distinctness and visual meaning means that Kubrick's cinematography is immediately identifiable, and is rife with information to dissect, making it ideal for analysis. From an educational standpoint, then, Kubrick films provide clear examples for teaching filmmaking craft. His scripts can be case studies in unique narrative form, adaptation, or philosophy, His cinematography can be analyzed in terms of overt aesthetic elements or subtle ones. And even if the essayist's aim is to celebrate rather than educate, well, put simply, Kubrick is a very good filmmaker. Why wouldn't we continue to talk about that?
So, Larissa Shepitko was an acclaimed Ukrainian filmmaker, born in 1938 and raised by a single mother amidst the destruction and aftermath of World War II. At age 16, she enrolled in the All-Russian State University of Cinematography, and by the age of 22, had completed her first feature film, Heat. In 1966, she completed her second film, Wings, centering on a female veteran fighter pilot struggling and ultimately failing to readjust to peacetime. Despite later being hailed as Shepitko's first masterpiece, Wings attracted controversy upon its release, with reviewers divided on Shepitko's unglamorous portrayal of a war hero. In fact, this divisive candor would remain a theme throughout Shepitko's work. Heroic myths were brutally stripped away, leaving instead unapologetically unpatriotic accounts of the toxic cost of war. Larissa Shepitko died in a sudden, tragic car accident in 1979. Though her work had been celebrated just at the cusp of breaking through Soviet Russia's unofficial suppression, she would largely be forgotten within a decade by audiences and critics alike. So to pretend that Stanley Kubrick's longevity within the public and critical consciousness is simply due to his craft is, maybe not the most complete answer we can give. So let's ask the question again. Why do we keep talking about Stanley Kubrick? Well, we can't ignore it. Stanley Kubrick was a white male filmmaker who rose to prominence with the help of a studio system that gave him massive levels of directorial control, and eventually carte blanche to make whatever he wanted, and a Hollywood culture that overlooked his and his producers' abusive treatment of stars in order to make great, profitable art. We talk about Kubrick today not merely because of his craft, but also because of the conditions within which he was able or permitted to practice, market, and distribute that craft. We talk about Kubrick because he is, as the theorists say, an auteur. Auteur theory evolved out of the 1940s French New Wave, drawing on the ideas of André Bazin and Alexandre Astruc, and later advanced by 1950s theorist François Truffaut. It held that the principal author of the film was the director rather than the screenwriter, and that there are distinct characteristics of style and worldview that run throughout a director's body of work. Andrew Sarris elaborated on these ideas in 1962 with his essay Notes on the Auteur Theory in 1962. He defined three key aspects of an auteur: technical competence, a distinguishable personality, and interior meaning, the relationship between a director's personality and his material. The original intent behind auteur theory was not to diminish the collaborative efforts of the many, many other people involved in the production of a film, or at least overtly to excuse the terrible actions of usually white male filmmakers in service of their art. Rather, it was meant to encourage the acceptance of film into the realm of serious art. But one dovetailed into the other. What is considered serious art is determined by the dominant majority, white men, And so once white male filmmakers got their consideration, of course auteur theory was used to justify their privilege over other, more marginalized creators. Even now, there's a sense that auteurs like Kubrick, who have been legitimized by canon and theory, are worth more. More money, more thought, more leniency, more preservation. Now, I want to make it clear that auteurs, or being an auteur, that's not inherently a bad thing. The problem is when it is used to justify gatekeeping, inequality, and/or abuse. The idea that for a mythical artist and their vision, we should overlook the very real harm they are doing to the people under their power.
For a person so charming and so likable, indeed lovable, he can do some pretty cruel things when you're filming, because it seemed to me at times that the end justified the means.
But I'm sure if you've spent any time in the Kubrick discourse, you've heard it all before. Kubrick was a genius. Actually, he was a terrible person. So I want to open up the discussion. What really is it about auteurs like Kubrick that draw us in? I think it's twofold. First, auteurs represent a kind of artist celebrity, so that both their easily identifiable work and their distinguishable personalities become points of discussion for us, the fans. And just like with celebrities, we can create comforting narratives about how those auteurs achieved success. They were geniuses. They were misunderstood. They were actually acting paternally when they were berating their lead actors. But second, because the auteur's work is fundamentally linked with their thoughts and feelings, as per Serres' definition, we believe we can know the auteur by examining their work closely enough. And who wouldn't want to know your favorite celebrity? Don't answer that.
I walked through the door with you. The air was cold, but something about it felt like home somehow. And
are you feeling nervous? Are you having fun? It's almost over, it's just begun. Don't overthink this, look in my eye. Don't be scared, don't be shy. Come on in, the water's fine.
And I mean, parts of this logic definitely make sense. Not that we can ever truly know a person based on their art, or that all art is some sort of autobiographical one-to-one of an author's experiences. But all art is, to some extent, influenced by experiences and worldview, and especially in the case of Stanley Kubrick, whose work was unabashedly political and ideological. It's not a stretch to see how they might have let in. This conflation of the art with the artist in some strange manifestation of a parasocial relationship is particularly marked with Stanley Kubrick because Stanley Kubrick's whole persona was one of mystery and controversy. He famously did not like to appear on screen or talk to press, to the point where, until the release of the documentary Making The Shining, very few critics, let alone fans, had heard Kubrick's voice. So fans really did have only Kubrick's films to look to in order to parse out who Stanley Kubrick was. Additionally, if you criticize Kubrick and point out his questionable or even outright harmful behavior, that in and of itself gets co-opted into the myth of Kubrick, whose whole career was embroiled in confusion, terrible reviews, and censorship before his films were vindicated by history. In that way, anything you say for or against him becomes part of Kubrick's auteur narrative. You are just taking sides in one more controversy involving the mysterious enigma. There is no escape. So why do we keep talking about Stanley Kubrick? Because he's Stanley Kubrick. Or at least, our conception of Stanley Kubrick, the auteur, built out of years of mythologizing and debunking a strange combination of truth, fiction, persona, and nostalgia. I wonder if, ironically, this idea of Kubrick is now even more a parallel to his art. An ambiguous symbol for the larger ideas of complicated auteurism and, I don't know, high art dick jokes.
Leave that alone, don't touch it! It's a very important work of art.
Speaking of, do you want to become your very own problematic auteur? Then let me introduce you to today's sponsor.
Welcome to my video essay, and today we're counting down the top 5 reasons why we're still thinking about Stanley Kubrick. Number 5. Great aesthetics. Stanley Kubrick's films are beautiful. Look at this footage from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's not so much that we have anything substantially new to add to the discussion, it's just that people will definitely watch the video if we're putting this amazing mise-en-scène in it. And it's easy to get great-looking or iconic stills to use for thumbnails, which helps our video essay attract more attention from viewers like you, and ultimately from the mighty YouTube algorithm. Number 4. Conspiracy theories. We don't actually have to break down cinematography, narrative, genre, context, or theory when we talk about Kubrick. Well, unless we want to. Because he was notoriously meticulous, Stanley Kubrick gave rise to numerous conspiracy theories that have captured film buffs' imagination for generations. We can just talk about them, and thousands of people will watch.
Do you realize that fluoridation is the most monstrously conceived and dangerous communist plot we have ever had to face?
Look, if we pause The Shining at any given frame and put a circle around a tiny detail in the background, this proves that Stanley Kubrick faked the moon landing. But that's just a theory. Number 3. Brand recognition. In this film criticism/video essay space, people know who Kubrick is. If they don't, they've seen Kubrickian influence everywhere. So they're going to click on our video. We want to make video essays about films that are prestigious enough to look like they're worth making video essays about, and mainstream enough that our audience doesn't feel too out of the loop. Kubrick is the perfect guy for the job. Number 2. Everyone wants an explanation. Kubrick was an ambiguous filmmaker, and according to everyone, no one can ever be sure of what he meant by anything. So we've got loads of room for interpretation. The best part is, it doesn't even have to be good. Face it, everybody loves listening to wacky theories and having their pretty basic takeaways validated. As long as the ending's snappy and the narrator's having fun, anything goes.
What would be?
The Shining is actually about domestic abuse? Groundbreaking. Hal's malfunction was caused by aliens? Tell me more. Across Kubrick's body of work, there is an ongoing fascination with troubled masculinity, and that raises some interesting questions about portrayals of toxicity and the relationships between art and social responsibility. Well, that might be hard to make into a catchy all-caps title, but yeah, we can do that. People will tune in. And finally, our number 1 reason why we're still talking about Stanley Kubrick. But before we go on, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out our inspiration for today's video.
Lev Manovich's 2001 book, The Language of New Media. In the section, The Myth of Interactivity, Manovich discusses the way modern interactive media has become a series of processes to externalize the mind. He says, mental processes of reflection, problem-solving, recall, and association are externalized. Before, we would look at an image and mentally follow our own private associations to other images. Now, interactive computer media asks us instead to click on an image in order to go to another image. Before, we would read a sentence of a story or a line of a poem and think of other lines, images, memories. Now, we are asked to follow pre-programmed, objectively existing associations. We are asked to mistake the structure of somebody else's mind for our own. Video essays are not interactive games, but Manovich's ideas can still apply. When essayists put images up on screen and provide voiceover narration analyzing them, we are externalizing the mental process of breaking down that piece of media. In other words, you don't have to worry about trying to figure out what the last act of 2001: A Space Odyssey means. Dozens and dozens of other people's minds have already worked it out, and you're welcome to follow them all the way down.
For a discount, if you use our code WEWANTMONEY, again, that's our code, WEWANTMONE. Have you liked and subscribed yet? Now, back to the video.
Don't know when, but I know we'll meet again.
Okay. Maybe I'm not being fair. In reality, there's not one singular reason we talk about Kubrick. Craft, context, capitalistic pragmatism, all of them are factors entangled together. I'm not exempt from this. I am writing this essay script because Kubrick is a good filmmaker, but I'm also writing it because my university has deemed Stanley Kubrick legitimate enough to be worthy of academic study. I'm writing it because transactionally I need to write it to get the grade to graduate. Craft, context, pragmatism. There's one other factor though, and that's love. Plenty of people just love Kubrick's films. Something within his perspective, his artistry, his direction, speaks to them. They may not love him as a person, but in one way or another, Kubrick is important to them. Maybe he showed them how music could elevate a scene, or maybe A Clockwork Orange was something that their dad insisted on watching together. Maybe the pretty footage of 2001: A Space Odyssey is what inspired them to go into film. Maybe Kubrick helped them understand something about themselves, or about the world around them. Making video essays is an arduous process. The amount of effort that it takes to research, compile, script, voice, and edit can be staggering. And so while consideration of a film's technical skill, or its place in history, or how many views you'll get, do factor into it, often creating a video essay is an expression of love. The creation and proliferation of video essays about Kubrick therefore become not just an intellectual exercise, but a communal sharing of appreciation, as if to say, you are not alone in loving this thing. And I get that. I've loved my own share of flawed media. I've grown up having to grapple with my own favorite directors being privileged and abusive. I would never begrudge the people the chance to share their own love of Kubrick, and I think the world is better for having all of their work in it. But it leaves me, perhaps, with the question I've really been asking all along. Why am I still talking about Kubrick? Underneath the craft, context, and pragmatism, why did I spend so much time on this video thing about Kubrick? Because it's not love. The truth is, I have never loved Kubrick, and I've never hated him. I've just been deeply exhausted by him. I've spent months analyzing his films, reading scholarly articles, and watching video essays in an attempt to explain and accept that exhaustion as part of Kubrick's mastery. It's the point, you know? You're supposed to be exhausted. That's what you're supposed to feel. As if in understanding why people cared about these films that made me tired and uncomfortable, I could come to appreciate Kubrick the way that they do. Wasn't I being ignorant otherwise? Was I not worldly enough, smart enough, open-minded enough? Didn't I have a responsibility to set aside my emotions and learn? After all, art has no obligation to be my emotional pacifier. But I think I'm gonna reinterpret that first bit. If you can't handle the existence of challenging media, then simply avoid consuming it. I read it as a dismissal, a jab at ability. If you can't take it, just go away. But maybe that's just what it says. Stanley Kubrick's art has no obligation to be my emotional pacifier. I have no obligation to twist myself into knots trying to engage with Stanley Kubrick's art. I can allow myself to be done. And so yeah, I'm done talking about Stanley Kubrick.